Jake Morrison pulled his hat down tight as the wind picked up strength. The old cowboy had seen plenty of weather in his 43 years, but something about today felt different. Wrong even. He'd been riding fence line for 3 hours now, checking for breaks after last week's cattle stampede, but the sky kept getting darker by the minute. His horse, a sturdy brown mare named Belle, snorted nervously and tossed her head. Animals always knew first when trouble was coming. Jake patted her neck and looked around. They were maybe 8 miles from the ranch house, deep into the rolling hills that bordered Apache country. Not exactly where you wanted to be when bad weather was brewing. The first snowflakes started falling around noon, big wet flakes that melted as soon as they hit the ground. Jake wasn't too worried yet. Arizona didn't get much snow, and when it did, it usually didn't amount to much. But within an hour, those lazy flakes turned into something else entirely. The wind began howling like a wild animal, and snow started coming down so thick, Jake could barely see Belle's ears in front of him. This wasn't the gentle Arizona snow he was used to. This was the kind of blizzard he remembered from his childhood in Colorado, the kind that could kill a man if he wasn't careful. Belle stumbled on a rock hidden under the growing snow. Jake dismounted to check her leg, and that's when he realized how serious their situation had become. The snow was already 6 inches deep and falling faster than he'd ever seen in these parts. The temperature had dropped so fast his breath came out in white puffs, and his fingers were starting to go numb even through his leather gloves. He tried to get his bearings, but everything looked the same now. White hills rolled into white valleys, and the familiar landmarks were disappearing under the storm. The old oak tree he used as a marker was barely visible through the swirling snow. Even the mountain peaks that usually guided him home were hidden behind thick gray clouds. Jake knew he was in trouble. Real trouble. He'd heard stories of men found frozen solid after getting lost in storms like this. Good men. Experienced men who thought they knew these hills better than their own backyard. Pride had killed more cowboys than all the rattlesnakes and outlaws combined. Belle was shivering now, ice forming on her whiskers. The poor animal was working twice as hard just to move through the deepening snow. Her breathing was heavy, and Jake could feel her struggling beneath him every time she took a step. They needed shelter, and they needed it soon. The wind was getting worse, creating drifts that came up to Belle's belly in some spots. Jake had to dismount and lead her through the worst of it, his boots sinking deep with every step. His feet were going numb, and his face felt like someone was slapping it with ice-cold leather. That's when panic tried to creep in. Jake had been in tight spots before, but this was different. Out here, with no shelter for miles and the storm getting stronger by the minute, a man could die real quick. He'd seen it happen to others. 1 minute you're thinking you'll make it home for supper, and the next minute you're lying in the snow, too tired and cold to get back up. But Jake Morrison hadn't survived this long by giving up easy. He forced himself to think clearly, to remember his training from those harsh Colorado winters. Find shelter. Get out of the wind, stay dry. Keep moving, but don't exhaust yourself. Simple rules that could mean the difference between seeing another sunrise or becoming another cautionary tale. He squinted through the blowing snow, looking for anything that might offer protection. A cave, an overhang, even a thick stand of trees would help. But the landscape around here was mostly open hills and scattered brush. Not much to stop the wind or provide real cover. Then Belle nickered softly and turned her head toward something off to their left. Jake followed her gaze and saw what looked like a faint wisp of smoke rising from a canyon about half a mile away. It was hard to tell for sure through all the snow, but Belle had better eyes than he did, and she seemed pretty sure about what she was seeing. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people, and people meant shelter. Jake knew this was Apache territory. He'd had dealings with some of the tribes before, mostly peaceful trades for water rights and passage through certain areas. But he also knew that not all encounters between cowboys and Apache ended well. There were still plenty of folks on both sides who held grudges from the old days. Still, freezing to death was a sure thing, while meeting unfriendly Apache was only a maybe. Jake made his choice and started leading Belle toward the smoke. The going was even tougher heading downhill into the canyon. The wind had carved deep drifts between the rocks, and Belle kept sinking in snow up to her chest. Jake had to pull and coax her along, both of them breathing hard from the effort. His hands were so cold now he could barely feel the reins. Ice had formed on his mustache and eyebrows, and his feet felt like blocks of wood in his boots. Every step was an effort, and he found himself stopping more often to catch his breath. The smoke was getting clearer as they got closer, definitely real and not just his imagination. Someone had a good fire going down there, probably in some kind of shelter tucked away from the worst of the wind. Jake felt a surge of hope mixed with nervousness. Whoever was down there, he'd have to trust that their humanity would outweigh any old conflicts. As they made their way down the rocky slope, Jake caught glimpses of what looked like a well-built shelter, cleverly positioned to take advantage of the canyon's natural windbreak. Smoke was rising from what appeared to be a proper chimney or smoke hole, not just an open fire. Belle seemed to sense safety ahead and picked up her pace despite the deep snow. Jake held tight to her reins, both of them sliding and stumbling down the last stretch of the slope. His legs were so cold and tired he nearly fell twice, catching himself on Belle's saddle horn. The storm was still raging above them, but down in the canyon, the wind wasn't quite so fierce. Jake could actually see more than a few feet ahead now, and what he saw made his heart pound with both relief and uncertainty. There was definitely a shelter ahead, and there were definitely people inside. He could hear voices now, speaking in a language he didn't understand. Apache voices, a woman's voice strong and clear even over the wind, and what sounded like children. Jake stopped for a moment, still hidden behind some rocks, trying to decide exactly how to approach this. He was a stranger, a white stranger, showing up at their door in the middle of a blizzard. That could go any number of ways. But Belle made the decision for him. The mare caught the scent of the fire and other horses, and let out a loud whinny that echoed off the canyon walls. So much for the element of surprise. Jake took a deep breath, said a quick prayer, and stepped out from behind the rocks. Whatever happened next, at least he'd tried. And maybe, just maybe, these strangers would turn out to be the kind of people who put human kindness ahead of old grudges. The woman appeared so suddenly that Jake nearly jumped out of his skin. One moment he was standing there in the swirling snow, wondering what to do next, and the next moment she was right there in front of him, moving like she'd materialized out of the storm itself. She was Apache. That much was clear from her dress and the way she carried herself. But what struck Jake most was how she looked at him, not with fear or anger, but with the sharp, calculating gaze of someone sizing up a situation fast. Her dark eyes took in everything at once: his frozen condition, his exhausted horse, the way he was swaying on his feet from cold and fatigue. Jake tried to speak, to explain himself, but his jaw was so stiff from the cold that only a croak came out. He was in worse shape than he'd realized. His legs felt like they might give out any second, and his hands were shaking so bad he could barely hold Belle's reins. The woman stepped closer, and Jake got a better look at her. She was maybe 30 years old, with long black hair braided back and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She wore traditional Apache clothing, but over it she had a heavy wool coat that looked like it had seen plenty of hard winters. This was someone who knew how to survive. She spoke to him in Apache first, words that sounded urgent but not unfriendly. When Jake just stared at her blankly, she switched to English without missing a beat. Her accent was slight, but her words were clear and confident. "You are lost," she said. It wasn't a question. Jake managed to nod. "Storm caught me," he croaked through chattering teeth. "Horse is tired. Don't know which way is home." She looked him up and down again, then glanced at Belle, who was standing with her head down, ice coating her muzzle. The mare was clearly at the end of her strength. "How long have you been in the storm?" the woman asked. 3 hours, maybe 4. Jake was having trouble thinking clearly. The cold was making everything fuzzy. Maybe longer. Hard to tell. The woman made a decision. She turned toward the shelter behind her and called out something in Apache. 2 small faces appeared at what Jake now realized was a doorway covered by a thick hide flap. Children, a boy and a girl, maybe 8 and 10 years old. Their eyes went wide when they saw the strange white man standing in their camp. The woman turned back to Jake and spoke words that would stick with him for the rest of his life. "Cowboy. We're shivering! Get in my shelter now!" There was no hesitation in her voice, no debate or discussion. She'd made up her mind, and that was that. She gestured toward the shelter with an authority that brooked no argument. Jake was so surprised he almost forgot how cold he was. In all his years dealing with different tribes, he'd never had anyone offer help so quickly and decisively. Usually there was a lot of talking first, a careful dance of figuring out intentions and establishing trust. "Your horse too," the woman continued, already moving toward Belle. "She will die if she stays out here." The woman examined Belle with experienced hands, checking her legs and breathing. She spoke softly to the mare and Apache, and somehow Belle seemed to calm down a little. Animals always responded to people who understood them. There is a sheltered spot behind the main shelter, she explained to Jake. For horses. Your mare will be warm and dry. Jake wanted to ask who she was, why she was helping him, what she wanted in return. But his brain wasn't working right. The cold had settled so deep into his bones that just staying upright was taking all his concentration. The woman seemed to understand. She took Belle's reins from Jake's numb fingers and started leading the horse toward the back of the shelter. Come, she said over her shoulder. Before you fall down. Jake stumbled after her, his boots sliding on the icy ground. Now that he wasn't fighting the wind, he could see how cleverly the shelter was positioned. It was built right against the canyon wall, taking advantage of a natural alcove that provided protection from three sides. The fourth side was covered with what looked like carefully fitted stones and thick hides that kept out the wind, but let smoke escape. Behind the main shelter was a smaller lean-to structure, clearly designed for animals. There were already 2 Indian ponies there, standing close together for warmth. They looked up curiously as Belle was led inside. The woman quickly unsaddled Belle and rubbed her down with a piece of rough cloth. She worked efficiently, like someone who'd done this many times before. Within minutes, Belle was covered with a heavy blanket and had her nose buried in a pile of dried grass. She will be fine, the woman said, patting Belle's neck. Apache horses, they know how to survive winter. Your mare will learn. Only then did she turn her full attention to Jake. What she saw clearly worried her. Jake was swaying on his feet, his face was gray with cold, and ice was forming on his clothes. You have frostbite starting, she said, examining his hands. How long since you could feel your fingers?
Jake tried to think.
Don't know. Well now. The woman muttered something in Apache that didn't sound complimentary. She grabbed Jake's arm and steered him toward the main shelter. Inside. Now. Before you lose toes. The warmth hit Jake like a physical blow as they ducked through the entrance. After hours in the bitter cold, the heated air felt almost too hot. A small fire burned in a fire pit lined with stones, and the smoke rose cleanly through a carefully engineered opening in the roof. The 2 children he'd seen earlier were sitting near the fire, wrapped in warm blankets. They watched Jake with curiosity but no fear. The boy said something to his mother in Apache, and she answered briefly before turning back to Jake. Sit here, she said, pointing to a spot near the fire but not too close. Warm up slowly, or you will be sick. Jake collapsed onto the spot she'd indicated, grateful beyond words to be out of the wind. The shelter was bigger inside than it had looked from outside, with enough room for the whole family plus supplies. Everything was organized and clean, the work of people who knew how to live efficiently in small spaces. A third child emerged from the shadows at the back of the shelter, a little girl, maybe 6 years old, with huge dark eyes and her mother's intelligent expression. She stared at Jake like he was the most interesting thing she'd ever seen. The woman knelt beside Jake and began examining his hands and feet with practiced skill. Her touch was gentle but firm as she checked for signs of serious frostbite. You are lucky, she said. Another hour and you would have lost fingers. Maybe toes. She spoke to the children in Apache, and they quickly brought her several items: a bowl of warm water, some kind of salve, and strips of soft cloth. She worked on Jake's hands first, warming them gradually and applying the salve to the worst spots. What is your name? She asked as she worked. Jake Morrison. I run cattle about 8 miles north of here. His voice was getting stronger as warmth returned to his body. I am Ayanna, the woman replied. These are my children, Tom, Lucy, and Beth. She indicated each child as she spoke. The names surprised Jake a little. They were English names, not Apache ones. My husband, he works with the Indian agent sometimes, Ayanna explained, as if reading his thoughts. The children, they go to the mission school when weather is good. They learn both ways, Apache way and white way. Jake nodded, beginning to understand. This wasn't just any Apache family. These were people who moved between 2 worlds, dealing with both cultures on a regular basis. As feeling returned to his hands, Jake realized just how close he'd come to serious trouble. Without this woman's help, he would have been in real danger. Maybe fatal danger. Why? He asked simply. Why help me? Ayanna looked up from bandaging his hands. For a moment, her expression was serious, almost sad. Because, she said quietly, out here, we are all just people trying to stay alive. The storm, it does not care if you are Apache or Cowboy. Cold is cold. Death is death. She finished with his hands and moved on to his feet, pulling off his ice-covered boots to check his toes. Besides, she added with the hint of a smile, my children, they have never seen a real cowboy up close. You are like a story come to life for them. The wind outside howled like a living thing, rattling the hide coverings and sending occasional puffs of snow through tiny gaps in the shelter walls. Jake had been warm for about an hour now, and he was finally starting to think clearly again. That's when the reality of his situation really hit him. He was stranded in an Apache shelter miles from home, with a family he'd never met before today. And judging by the sound of that wind, he wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. Ayanna seemed to read his thoughts. She was sitting across the fire from him, mending what looked like a torn piece of clothing with quick, efficient stitches. Her children were playing quietly in the back of the shelter, some kind of game involving small stones and soft singing. The storm will last through tomorrow, maybe longer, she said without looking up from her sewing. I have seen storms like this before. They come fast and stay long. Jake nodded, though part of him hoped she was wrong. My ranch hands will be looking for me when I don't come back tonight. In this weather? No. Ayanna's voice was matter-of-fact, not unkind. No one is stupid enough to go out in this storm. They will wait for it to pass, then look for you. She was right, of course. Jake knew his men well enough to know they'd use their heads. They'd secure the ranch, protect the cattle as best they could, and wait for better weather before mounting any kind of search. It's what Jake would have ordered them to do. So we wait, he said. So we wait. Ayanna tied off her thread and set the mended clothing aside. But first we share what we have and make sure everyone stays alive until the storm passes. It was then that Jake really looked around the shelter and realized something that made his chest tighten with worry. There wasn't a lot of food visible, some dried meat hanging from the rafters, a few baskets that might contain grain or roots, but not much else, and there were 4 mouths to feed here, soon to be 5 counting him. Ayanna noticed his expression. We were gathering winter supplies when the storm caught us too, she admitted. My husband, he is hunting with the other men. They will bring back meat for the cold months, but they are 3 days away, maybe more now with this weather. Jake felt a stab of guilt. Here he was, eating their food and using their warmth when they barely had enough for themselves. But when he started to say something, Ayanna held up her hand. Do not speak of leaving, she said firmly. You would not make it 1 mile in this storm. And we do not turn away people who need help. That is not our way. It's not mine either, Jake said. He reached into his saddlebags, which Ayanna had thoughtfully brought inside when she'd helped him settle in. From one of the pockets, he pulled out a package wrapped in oilcloth. Jerky and hardtack, he explained. Not fancy, but it'll keep you alive. From another pocket, he produced a small burlap bag. Coffee beans. Real ones, not chicory. Ayanna's eyes lit up at the sight of the coffee. It has been months since we had real coffee, she admitted. The children had heard the word coffee and crowded around, their eyes bright with curiosity. Tom, the oldest boy, said something in Apache that made his mother smile. He asks if cowboys really drink coffee for breakfast every day. Like in the stories, Ayanna translated. Jake grinned, his first real smile since the storm started. Every morning if we can get it. Sometimes for lunch and dinner too. While Ayanna prepared the coffee over the fire, Jake distributed pieces of jerky to the children. They chewed the tough dried meat with obvious enjoyment, and Jake realized they probably hadn't eaten much today. As the rich smell of brewing coffee filled the shelter, something shifted in the atmosphere. The initial tension of strangers sharing space began to ease into something more comfortable. They were no longer an Apache family and a white cowboy thrown together by accident. They were just people, sharing what they had to survive a dangerous situation. Tell me about this storm, Jake said, accepting a cup of the hot coffee. You said you've seen ones like it before? Ayanna settled back with her own cup, savoring the first sip. When I was a child, a storm like this lasted 5 days. Many people died that winter. Cattle, too. The old ones, they say such storms come every 10, 15 years. This is the first big one since I became a mother. She looked toward her children, who were now examining Jake's saddlebags with fascination. Lucy, the middle child, had found his spare pair of spurs and was holding them up to the firelight, watching them sparkle. The children, they have never been in a storm this bad, Ayanna continued. Tom tries to be brave, but I can see he is frightened. Lucy asks too many questions when she is scared. And Beth, she gestured toward the youngest, who was now sitting close to Jake, apparently having decided he was trustworthy. Beth thinks this is all an adventure. Jake looked at the little girl, who couldn't be more than 6. She was examining his hat with serious concentration, trying to figure out how the band stayed on. There was no fear in her face, just curiosity about this strange new person who had appeared in her home. Maybe it is an adventure, Jake said gently. A scary one, but still an adventure. That evening, as the storm continued to rage outside, they settled into an unexpected routine. Ayanna cooked a simple stew using some of the dried vegetables she'd been gathering, Jake's jerky and water melted from snow. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot and filling, and it tasted better than many meals Jake had eaten at expensive restaurants back east. The children were fascinated by their unexpected guest. Tom wanted to know everything about cattle ranching, how many cows Jake owned, how far they roamed, what it was like to be in a stampede. Lucy was more interested in practical things. How did he keep his boots so clean? Why did his hat have that particular shape? Where did he buy his horse? Beth, the youngest, seemed content just to sit near him and occasionally touch his arm or his hat, as if to make sure he was real. As the night deepened, Ayanna began to tell stories. Apache stories, mostly, about clever coyotes and wise grandmothers, about brave hunters and magical places hidden in the desert. Her voice was soft and rhythmic, and even though Jake didn't understand all the cultural references, he found himself drawn into the tales. When she finished one particularly exciting story about a warrior who outwitted a giant bear, Tom turned to Jake expectantly. "Now you tell a story," the boy said in careful English. "A cowboy story." Jake thought for a moment, then began to tell about the time he and his partner had to drive 100 head of cattle through a flash flood. He kept it simple, focusing on the adventure rather than the danger, but he could see all 3 children hanging on every word. As he talked, Jake realized something was happening that he hadn't expected. The fear and uncertainty he'd felt earlier were fading, replaced by something warmer. These weren't just strangers who had helped him out of duty or obligation. They were good people, kind people who had opened their home to him without question. Later, when the children were asleep and the adults sat quietly by the dying fire, Ayanna spoke softly. "You are not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring into the glowing coals. "My people have not always been treated well by white ranchers. There have been conflicts, over land, over water, over misunderstandings." Jake nodded. He knew the history, the tensions that still existed between settlers and the various Apache tribes. "I've heard the stories too. Some of them probably true, some probably not. But you came to our fire anyway, when you needed help, and you let me in, even though I'm a stranger." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the wind and the soft breathing of the sleeping children. "Tomorrow will be hard," Ayanna said finally. "The storm may get worse before it gets better. We will need to be careful with food and fuel." "We'll manage," Jake said, and he meant it. Whatever challenges tomorrow brought, they would face them together. Apache and Cowboy, strangers no more. The second night was harder than the first. The storm had not only continued, it had gotten worse. The wind sounded like it was trying to tear the whole canyon apart, and snow was piling up so deep outside that Jake wondered if they'd be able to dig their way out when it finally stopped. The children were restless and scared. Tom kept asking when his father would come home. Lucy had developed a nervous habit of counting and recounting the dried corn kernels in one of the storage baskets. Even little Beth, who had been so brave the first day, was clinging close to her mother and jumping at every loud gust of wind. Ayanna did her best to keep them calm, but Jake could see the worry in her eyes. They were stretching their food supplies thin. The fire was eating up their fuel faster than expected, and there was no telling how much longer the storm would last. That's when Jake remembered something his own mother used to do during the long Colorado winters of his childhood. "Who wants to hear about the time I met Wild Bill Hickok?" he asked, settling himself more comfortably by the fire. The children's heads snapped up immediately. Even Tom, who had been trying so hard to act grown up, looked interested despite himself. "You met Wild Bill?" Lucy asked, her eyes wide. "The real Wild Bill Hickok?" "Cross my heart," Jake said solemnly. "This was about 10 years ago when I was working a cattle drive up through Kansas. We'd stopped in a little town called Cedar Creek to rest the herd and give the men a chance to get cleaned up. As Jake launched into the story, he watched the children's faces transform. Their fear and worry faded, replaced by wonder and excitement. He told them about Wild Bill's famous revolvers, about his long hair and fancy clothes, about the poker game that lasted 3 days straight. When he finished, Tom immediately demanded another story. So Jake told them about the great cattle stampede of '78, about the time he helped catch a notorious cattle rustler, about the winter when he and his partner got snowed in for 2 weeks with nothing but beans to eat. Ayanna listened too, sometimes translating parts for the children when Jake used words they didn't know, but mostly she just watched, and Jake could see her relaxing as her children's spirits lifted. When Jake's voice started to get hoarse, Ayanna took over. She told Apache stories that Jake had never heard before, tales about the creation of the world, about why the owl hunts at night, about a magical horse that could run on air. Her voice was musical when she spoke in Apache, and even though Jake couldn't understand the words, he found himself drawn into the rhythm of the stories. Lucy, who had seemed especially nervous earlier, began to participate. She knew some of the stories and would chime in with sound effects or act out parts of the tales. Soon she was giggling and clapping her hands, the scared little girl replaced by an excited storyteller. During one particularly animated story about a race between a rabbit and a turtle, which sounded suspiciously familiar to Jake, Beth fell asleep curled up against Jake's side. He looked down at the little girl and felt something tighten in his chest. When had she become so comfortable with him? When had he started thinking of her as something more than just a stranger's child? "She likes you," Ayanna said softly, noticing his expression. "Children, they know good people from bad ones. Animals, too." As if summoned by the mention of animals, Belle whinnied from the horse shelter behind them. Through a small gap in the wall, Jake could see his mare standing close to the Apache ponies, all 3 animals sharing warmth and companionship. Even Belle's making friends, Jake observed. "Horses are smart that way," Tom said seriously. He had inherited his mother's gift for reading animals. "They do not care what tribe you are from, only if you are kind or mean." The boy's simple wisdom struck Jake as profound. Out of the mouths of babes, as his own mother used to say. As the night wore on, the stories gradually changed from exciting adventures to gentler tales. Ayanna told them about her grandmother, who could predict the weather by watching the way spiders built their webs. Jake shared memories of his father, who could gentle the wildest horse just by talking to it. Lucy told them about her favorite hiding spot near the creek back home, where she went to think when the world felt too big and complicated. Tom admitted that he sometimes talked to his horse like it was a person, and that the horse seemed to understand every word. "What about your family, Jake?" Ayanna asked gently. "Do you have children of your own?" Jake was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "Had a wife once," he said finally. "Mary. She died of fever about 5 years back. We never had children, though we wanted them." The shelter fell silent except for the wind outside. Beth stirred in her sleep and snuggled closer to Jake's side. "I am sorry," Ayanna said simply. "So am I. Mary would have liked you folks. She always said the measure of people wasn't what they looked like or where they came from, but how they treated strangers in need." Tom, who had been listening intently, suddenly spoke up. "Is that why you were not afraid to come to our fire? Because your wife taught you that?" The question caught Jake off guard. He thought about it seriously before answering. "Maybe so, son. Maybe so." Lucy, not to be outdone by her older brother's thoughtfulness, asked her own question. "Do you miss her every day?" Another tough question from a child. Jake looked at the little girl who was watching him with the same intelligent eyes as her mother. "Every day," he admitted. "But missing someone isn't all sadness, you know. Sometimes it's happy memories, too, like how she used to sing while she cooked or the way she laughed when she thought something was really funny." "Maybe she is watching over you," Beth said sleepily, without opening her eyes. "Maybe that is how you knew to come to our fire when you were lost." The simple faith in the child's voice made Jake's throat tight. He looked up to find Ayanna watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "My husband, he has been gone hunting for 6 days now," she said quietly. "The children, they worry about him in weather like this. I worry too." It was the first time she'd admitted being scared, and Jake realized what courage it had taken for her to help a stranger when her own husband was out there somewhere in the storm. He'll make it back, Jake said with more confidence than he felt. Apache are the best hunters and trackers in the territory. If anyone can survive in this weather, it's them. Tell us about hunting, Mama, Lucy said, apparently deciding they all needed distraction from scary thoughts. Tell us about when Papa caught the big deer. So Ayanna told them about her husband's hunting skills, about the time he tracked a wounded elk for 3 days through difficult terrain, about how he could read animal signs that other hunters couldn't even see. As she talked, Jake found himself building a mental picture of the man. Someone skilled and patient, someone who took care of his family and understood the land, someone not so different from Jake himself, really, just with different customs and different challenges. The stories continued deep into the night. They shared tales of childhood adventures, of beloved pets, of funny mishaps and narrow escapes. With each story, the barriers between them seemed to dissolve a little more. Jake told them about his first attempt at riding a wild bronco, which had ended with him face first in a water trough. Ayanna shared the story of her wedding day, when a sudden dust storm had turned the ceremony into an adventure none of them would ever forget. Even the children contributed their own small stories. Tom's account of catching his first fish, Lucy's description of finding a baby bird and nursing it back to health, Beth's rambling tale about a dream where she could fly like an eagle. As the fire burned lower and the stories grew gentler, Jake realized that something important was happening. These weren't just tales to pass the time anymore. They were building something: trust, understanding, maybe even friendship. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside their small shelter, warmed by fire and human connection, 5 strangers were becoming something more. They were becoming a family, if only for a few days. Jake woke up on the 3rd morning to the sound of coughing. Not the dry cough of someone with dust in their throat, but the deep, wet cough that meant real trouble. Little Beth was still curled up beside him, but now she was burning with fever. Her small face was flushed red, and when Jake gently touched her forehead, her skin felt like it was on fire. Ayanna was already awake, kneeling beside her youngest daughter with a worried expression that made Jake's stomach clench. She was speaking softly in Apache, her voice carrying the particular tone that mothers use when they're trying to stay calm while their child is sick. "How long has she been like this?" Jake asked quietly, trying not to wake Tom and Lucy, who were still sleeping on the other side of the fire. "She started coughing in the night," Ayanna replied, not taking her eyes off Beth. "The fever came with the dawn. It is bad but not the worst I have seen." Jake wasn't convinced. He'd seen plenty of sickness in his time. Cowboys lived rough lives and illness was a constant threat. Beth looked really sick, the kind of sick that could turn dangerous fast if it wasn't handled right. Ayanna seemed to read his thoughts. "I have medicines," she said, reaching for a leather pouch hanging from the shelter wall. "Willow bark for the fever, root tea for the cough. My grandmother taught me these things." She began preparing the remedies with practiced hands, but Jake could see the tension in her shoulders. Being a mother was hard enough when you were home with a medicine man nearby. Being a mother in a storm shelter miles from help, with limited supplies and a strange white man as your only assistance, had to be terrifying. Beth's cough got worse as the morning progressed. Each coughing fit left her more exhausted, and she barely responded when her mother tried to get her to drink the willow bark tea. Tom and Lucy woke up and immediately saw that something was wrong. They huddled together, watching their baby sister with frightened eyes. "Is she going to be okay, Mama?" Lucy whispered. "She will be fine," Ayanna said firmly, but Jake heard the uncertainty underneath her confident words. By midday, Beth's fever had climbed even higher. She was delirious now, muttering in Apache and occasionally crying out for her father. Ayanna tried everything she knew: cool cloths on the forehead, different herbal teas, gentle massages to help with the cough. Nothing seemed to help much. Jake felt completely useless. He was good with injured cattle and hurt horses, but sick children were way outside his experience. All he could do was keep the fire going, melt snow for drinking water, and try to keep Tom and Lucy distracted while their mother worked. But as the afternoon wore on, even Jake could see that Beth was getting worse instead of better. Her breathing was becoming labored and her skin had taken on a grayish tint that scared him more than anything else about this whole situation. Ayanna finally looked up from her daughter's side, and Jake saw something in her eyes that made his blood run cold. It was the look of a mother who was running out of options. "In town," she said quietly, "there is a doctor, a white doctor who has treated Apache children before. He has medicines I do not have." Jake knew immediately what she was asking, even though she hadn't actually asked it yet. "How far?" "Cedar Ridge, maybe 15 miles from here." But in this storm, she didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what the chances were of making it 15 miles through deep snow and howling wind. "If we wait for the storm to clear, it might be too late," Jake said. Ayanna nodded, tears forming in her eyes for the first time since Jake had met her. "But if we try to travel now, we might all die." Not just Beth, it was an impossible choice. Risk everyone to save one, or watch helplessly while a little girl who had come to trust him suffered. Jake looked at Beth, who was now so weak she could barely open her eyes. Then he looked at Tom and Lucy, who were watching their mother with the terrified expression of children who suddenly realize their parents don't have all the answers. "We're not all going," he said suddenly. "I'm taking her. Just me and Beth on Belle." "No." Ayanna's voice was fierce. "She is my daughter. If anyone takes her, it will be me." "You're needed here," Jake argued. "Tom and Lucy need their mother. What happens to them if something goes wrong and you don't come back? What happens to Beth if she dies because I was too afraid to try to save her?" It was a fair point, but Jake had already made up his mind. "I know the way to Cedar Ridge, storm or no storm. I've ridden that trail dozens of times. And Belle is strong enough to carry us both if I'm careful." Ayanna stared at him for a long moment. "Why would you do this? Risk your life for a child who is not yours?" Jake looked down at Beth, remembering how she had fallen asleep against his side just 2 nights ago, trusting him completely. "Because she is mine now," he said simply. "You all are. Family doesn't always mean blood." The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise Ayanna, but they were true. Somewhere in the last 3 days, these strangers had become his family. He couldn't explain it, couldn't rationalize it, but there it was. Tom, who had been listening to the whole conversation, suddenly spoke up. "I want to go too." "No," both adults said at the same time. "She's my sister," Tom protested. "I should help protect her." Jake knelt down so he was eye level with the boy. "The best way you can protect her is by staying here and taking care of your mother and Lucy. Someone needs to keep the fire going and watch for your father when he comes back." It was a job that made Tom feel important while keeping him safe. And the boy seemed to understand that. Ayanna was still struggling with the decision. Jake could see her mind working, weighing all the terrible possibilities. "I have money," Jake said quietly. "The doctor in Cedar Ridge knows me. He'll treat her, no questions asked. And if you get lost in the storm, if Belle can't make it through the snow?" Jake was quiet for a moment. "Then at least we tried. At least she doesn't die because we were too scared to take the chance." Ayanna closed her eyes and was silent for a long time. When she opened them again, Jake saw that she had made her decision. "If you do this thing," she said slowly, "you will always be welcome in any Apache home. What you offer to do, there are no words for such kindness." "I'm not doing it to be kind," Jake said, gently lifting the feverish little girl into his arms. "I'm doing it because she's my family now, and you don't abandon family." As he prepared to brave the storm with Beth bundled against his chest, Jake wondered if he was making a terrible mistake. The chances of making it to town alive were probably less than 50-50. But looking down at Beth's flushed face, feeling her labored breathing against his chest, he knew he had to try. Some things were worth risking everything for. And sometimes family wasn't about blood or tribe or color. Sometimes it was just about love. Jake had never been so grateful to see sunlight in his entire life. When he pushed aside the hide covering the shelter entrance on the 4th morning, actual sunshine streamed through the canyon, weak and pale but real. The storm had finally broken during the night. The wind had died down to almost nothing, and no new snow was falling. But what Jake saw when he stepped outside made his heart sink. Snow was everywhere, not just a few inches or even a few feet, but massive drifts that reached higher than a man's head in some places. The landscape had been completely transformed into an alien world of white hills and valleys that bore no resemblance to the country Jake knew. Belle and the Apache ponies were fine, protected in their shelter and warm under their blankets, but getting them out and moving was going to be a challenge. The snow around the horse shelter was nearly 4 feet deep. Beth was worse. Much worse. During the night, her fever had climbed so high that she was barely conscious, and her breathing had become shallow and rapid. Even Jake, with his limited experience with childhood illnesses, could see that they were running out of time. Ayanna had spent the entire night applying cool cloths and trying to get fluids into her daughter, but nothing was helping. The little girl who had been so curious and playful just days before was now a tiny, burning bundle of sickness who rarely opened her eyes. "We have to go now," Jake said, though he dreaded the journey ahead. Storm or no storm, she can't wait any longer. Ayanna nodded, her face gray with exhaustion and worry. She had prepared a bundle of warm clothes and blankets, plus what remained of their food supplies. "I will come with you," she said again. They'd had this argument several times already, but Jake remained firm. "Tom and Lucy need you here, and someone has to be here when your husband gets back." What Jake didn't say was that he honestly wasn't sure all three of them would make it to town alive. The smart thing to do was minimize the risk, take only Beth and himself. If something happened to them, at least Ayanna would still be here for her other children. Digging Belle out of the horse shelter took nearly 2 hours of hard work. Jake and Tom took turns with a piece of wood they used as a shovel, breaking through the crusty snow that had drifted against the entrance. Belle seemed eager to get moving once she was free, stamping her feet and snorting at the strange white landscape. Jake rigged up a carrying sling using some of the rope from his saddlebags and one of Ayanna's blankets. It would allow him to keep Beth secure against his chest while still having his hands free to control Belle's reins. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best he could manage. The goodbye was harder than Jake had expected. Tom tried to be brave, but tears ran down his cheeks as he hugged his little sister. Lucy clung to Beth for a long moment, whispering something in Apache that Jake couldn't understand. Ayanna was the hardest. She held her daughter for what might be the last time, speaking softly in her native language, probably prayers or blessings or just the things a mother says when she's terrified she might never see her child again. When she handed Beth over to Jake, her hands were shaking. "Bring her home to me," she said simply. "I will," Jake promised, hoping desperately that it was a promise he could keep. The first mile was the worst. Belle sank up to her chest with every step, and Jake had to dismount repeatedly to lead her through the deepest drifts. Beth was a small weight against his chest, but he could feel her fever burning through all the layers of blankets. Progress was painfully slow. What should have been a 15-minute ride stretched into an hour, then 2 hours. Jake's legs were soaked through from wading in snow and his boots were caked with ice. Belle was working so hard her breath came out in great white puffs and foam was forming around her bit. By midday they had covered maybe 4 miles. At this rate it would take them until nightfall to reach town, assuming they could keep moving at all. Jake was beginning to wonder if he'd made a terrible mistake. That's when he heard the howling. At first, Jake thought it was just wind echoing off the canyon walls, but Belle's ears pricked forward and she began moving nervously, telling him that what he was hearing was something much more dangerous than weather. Wolves. A pack of them, from the sound of it, and they were close. Jake's blood turned cold. Wolves in winter were desperate creatures, willing to attack almost anything if they were hungry enough. A man on foot in deep snow carrying a sick child would look like an easy target. He urged Belle forward faster, but the deep snow made speed impossible. Behind them, the howling was getting closer. Jake could hear individual voices now, at least 4 or 5 wolves, maybe more. Then he saw them. Dark shapes moving through the white landscape, flowing like shadows between the scattered trees. They were still a few hundred yards away, but they were definitely following Belle's trail through the snow. Jake's mind raced through his options. He had his rifle, but shooting from horseback while holding Beth would be nearly impossible. And even if he managed to hit 1 or 2 wolves, the rest of the pack would still be a threat. Belle sensed the danger and began moving faster, struggling through the drifts with renewed urgency. But Jake could see she was tiring rapidly. Carrying 2 riders through deep snow while being pursued by predators was asking more than any horse could give for long. The wolves were getting closer. Jake could see them clearly now, lean, winter-hungry shapes with ice hanging from their muzzles. They moved with the patient confidence of predators who knew they had cornered their prey. That's when Jake remembered something Ayanna had told him during one of their long conversations. Apache hunters knew that wolves, like most predators, preferred easy targets. If you could make yourself look dangerous instead of helpless, sometimes they would look for easier prey elsewhere. Jake pulled Belle to a stop and very carefully dismounted, making sure Beth remained secure in her carrying sling. Then he pulled his rifle from the saddle boot and checked to make sure it was loaded. The wolves had stopped too, about 100 yards away. They sat in the snow, watching him with intelligent yellow eyes, trying to figure out if he was worth the risk. Jake raised his rifle and fired a shot into the air. The sound echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, and the wolves scattered, disappearing into the brush and rocks. But Jake knew they wouldn't go far. They were just waiting, following, looking for a moment when his guard was down. The chase continued for another hour. Every few minutes, Jake would catch glimpses of dark shapes moving parallel to their trail, always just out of rifle range but close enough to be a constant threat. Belle was struggling badly now, stumbling frequently and breathing hard. Then, just when Jake was beginning to think they weren't going to make it, the landscape began to look familiar. They were getting close to the main road that led to Cedar Ridge. If they could just reach that road, the going would be easier, and the wolves would be less likely to follow them into more populated areas. But first they had to get there, and the wolves seemed to sense that their prey was tiring. They were getting bolder, moving closer, beginning to circle instead of just following. Jake made a decision. Instead of trying to outrun them, he would face them down. He found a spot where some large rocks created a natural barrier behind him, dismounted and prepared to make a stand. The largest wolf, clearly the pack leader, approached to within 50 yards and sat down, studying Jake with those unnerving yellow eyes. Jake raised his rifle and took careful aim. He didn't want to kill the animal unless he had to, but he needed to show that he was a threat worth avoiding. The rifle cracked, and snow exploded just in front of the lead wolf. The animal jumped back, startled, then looked at Jake with what seemed like new respect. After a long moment, the wolf turned and trotted away. The rest of the pack followed. Jake waited several minutes to make sure they were really gone before remounting Belle and continuing toward the road. Beth stirred in her blankets and mumbled something he couldn't understand, but at least she was still breathing. When they finally reached the main road to Cedar Ridge, Jake nearly cried with relief. The road had been traveled recently, probably by supply wagons, and the snow was packed down enough for Belle to walk without sinking to her chest. They made good time for the remaining miles to town, and Jake began to believe they might actually make it. Beth's fever seemed to have stabilized, though she was still dangerously ill. As the buildings of Cedar Ridge came into view in the late afternoon sun, Jake allowed himself to hope. They had made it through the storm, fought off wolves, and covered 15 miles of difficult terrain. Now they just had to hope that the doctor would be in town, and that he would have the medicines Beth needed to survive. Cedar Ridge looked like a ghost town when Jake rode down Main Street with Beth bundled against his chest. Most of the buildings were still half buried in snow, and very few people were moving around. The storm had hit the town just as hard as it had hit the surrounding countryside. Jake headed straight for Doc Patterson's office, a small building with a painted sign that read medical practice in faded letters. The doctor was a decent man who had treated Jake's ranch hands before, and Jake hoped he would be willing to help now. But when Jake pushed through the door carrying Beth, the first person he encountered wasn't the doctor. It was Mrs. Coleman, the banker's wife, who was apparently waiting to see the doctor about something herself. Mrs. Coleman took one look at the sick Apache child in Jake's arms and her face went hard.
"What do you think you're doing, Morrison?"
"Getting medical help for a sick little girl," Jake replied, not in the mood for pleasantries. Beth was burning with fever and barely conscious. He didn't have time for small talk. "That's an Indian child," Mrs. Coleman said, as if Jake might not have noticed. "That's a sick child," Jake corrected. "Where's Doc Patterson?" Mrs. Coleman stood up, blocking his path to the inner office. She was a large woman with strong opinions about most things, and she clearly had opinions about this situation, too. "You can't bring that savage in here," she said, her voice getting louder. "This is a place for civilized people. There are Apache medicine men for their kind." Jake felt his temper rise, but he forced himself to stay calm. Getting into an argument with Mrs. Coleman wouldn't help Beth. "The nearest Apache medicine man is probably 100 miles away," he said evenly. "This child needs help now." "Then you should have thought of that before you got yourself mixed up with Indians," Mrs. Coleman snapped. That's when Doc Patterson himself appeared in the doorway of his examination room. He was a thin, elderly man with kind eyes and gentle hands, the sort of person who had become a doctor because he genuinely wanted to help people. "What's all the commotion out here?" he asked, then saw Beth in Jake's arms. His expression immediately became serious. "Good Lord, Jake, what happened?" "Got caught in the storm with this family," Jake explained quickly. "The little girl came down with fever and bad cough yesterday. Her mother tried everything she knew, but she's getting worse." Doc Patterson moved closer to examine Beth, but Mrs. Coleman stepped between them again. "Doctor, you can't seriously be considering treating this Indian child," she said. "What would people think? What would your other patients say?" Doc Patterson looked at her with the same expression he might give to something unpleasant he'd found on his boot. "Mrs. Coleman, I took an oath to help sick people. I didn't notice any exceptions for race or tribe in that oath. But doctor, but nothing." Doc Patterson's voice carried an authority that made Mrs. Coleman step back. "This is my office, and I'll treat whoever needs treating. If you have a problem with that, you're welcome to find another doctor." He turned to Jake. "Bring her into the examination room. Let's see what we're dealing with." As Jake carried Beth into the inner office, he could hear Mrs. Coleman behind them, muttering about Indian lovers and the decline of civilization. He tried to ignore her, but her words stung. He'd lived in this territory for 15 years, built a successful ranch, earned the respect of his neighbors. Now some of them would probably never look at him the same way again. Doc Patterson was all business as he examined Beth. He checked her temperature, listened to her breathing, looked at her throat and eyes. His face grew more concerned as the examination continued. "Pneumonia," he said finally, "probably brought on by exposure to cold and wet conditions. She's in bad shape, Jake. Another day or two without treatment and—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Jake understood. "Can you help her?" "I think so. I've got some new medicines that should bring the fever down and help with the lung infection. But she'll need to stay here for several days, maybe a week. This isn't something you can treat in a storm shelter." Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. They'd made it. Beth was going to be okay, but Doc Patterson wasn't finished. "There's just one problem," he said quietly. "Keeping an Apache child here for a week is going to cause talk. Loud talk. Some folks in town won't like it." "Let them talk," Jake said firmly. "This little girl's life is more important than gossip." "I agree," Doc Patterson said. "But you need to understand what you're getting yourself into. Some people will see this as taking sides in conflicts that go back years. They'll question your loyalty, your judgment, maybe your sanity." Jake looked down at Beth, who was stirring slightly as the doctor's medicines began to take effect. "Doc, 3 days ago I was lost in the worst storm I've ever seen. Half frozen and ready to die. This child's mother took me into her home without hesitation, shared her food, kept me alive. Now her daughter is sick, and I'm going to make sure she gets the help she needs. If that makes some people mad, so be it." Doc Patterson smiled for the first time since Jake had arrived. "That's what I hoped you'd say. Don't worry about the medical bills. I'll put it on your account." "Thanks, Doc. I need to send word back to her family. Let them know she's safe." "I'll have my boy ride out with a message once the roads are clearer," the doctor promised. But when Jake stepped back into the waiting room, he found that word of his arrival had already spread. A small crowd had gathered outside the doctor's office, and their faces weren't friendly. Frank Miller, who owned the general store, was the first to speak up. "Jake Morrison, what the hell do you think you're doing?" "Getting medical help for a sick child," Jake replied, the same answer he'd given Mrs. Coleman. "That's an Apache child," Miller continued, as if that explained everything. "So?" "So we've got enough problems with Indians without encouraging them to think they can come into town whenever they want," said another voice from the crowd. Jake recognized Bill Hudson, who ran the livery stable. "This child didn't choose to come to town," Jake said, his patience wearing thin. "She's sick and might die without treatment." "Since when do we let children die because of the color of their skin? Since they're Apache children whose fathers might be the same ones who've been rustling our cattle," Hudson shot back. That hit close to home. There had been some cattle rustling in the area recently, and some folks suspected Apache involvement, though there was no real proof. "You know what I've learned these past few days?" Jake said, raising his voice so the whole crowd could hear. "I've learned that Apache children laugh and cry and get scared just like white children. I've learned that Apache mothers worry about their kids just like white mothers. And I've learned that when push comes to shove, decent people help each other regardless of what tribe they belong to." "Pretty speech," said a new voice. Jake turned to see Sheriff Wilson pushing through the crowd. "But it doesn't change the fact that you're stirring up trouble." I'm saving a child's life, Jake replied. You're involving yourself in Indian affairs, the sheriff countered. That makes some people nervous. Maybe those people should worry less about Indians and more about being decent human beings. The crowd was getting more agitated, and Jake could see the situation was about to get out of hand. That's when an unexpected voice spoke up from behind him. Mr. Morrison is doing the right thing. Everyone turned to see Father Miguel, the priest from the small Catholic church at the edge of town. He was a soft-spoken man who rarely got involved in political disputes, but apparently he'd decided to make an exception. Every child is a child of God, the priest continued. Every sick child deserves care and compassion, regardless of their parentage. Mr. Morrison has shown Christian charity of the highest order. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. It was one thing to argue with a rancher, but arguing with a priest was different territory entirely. Sheriff Wilson seemed to sense that the mood was changing. All right, folks, let's all go home. The excitement's over. As the crowd began to disperse, Jake caught the sheriff's arm. Thanks for keeping things calm. Sheriff Wilson looked at him seriously. Don't thank me yet, Jake, this isn't over. Some folks have long memories and strong feelings about Indians. You've made some enemies today. I can live with that, Jake said, can you? What happens when you need those same people to help you round up rustlers or deal with other problems? What happens to your business relationships? Jake looked back toward the examination room where Beth was fighting for her life. Some things are more important than business relationships, Sheriff. As Jake settled in for what would be a long night of waiting and worrying, he realized that Sheriff Wilson was probably right. He had made enemies today, people who would question his judgment and his loyalty from now on, but he had also discovered something about himself that he hadn't known before. When it came to choosing between social acceptance and doing what was right, the choice was easier than he'd ever imagined. Beth's fever finally broke on the third day. Jake was dozing in a chair beside her bed when he heard her small voice asking for water in Apache. When he looked down, her dark eyes were clear and alert for the first time since they'd arrived in town. Hey there, little one, Jake said softly, helping her sit up to drink. How are you feeling? Better, Beth whispered in English. Where is Mama? She's back at the shelter with Tom and Lucy, waiting for you to get well enough to go home, Jake explained. Doc Patterson says that should be in just a few more days. Beth nodded solemnly, then looked around the unfamiliar room. This is the White Doctor's place? Yes, he's been taking good care of you. Will you tell him thank you from me? Jake smiled. Even sick and far from home, this little girl remembered her manners. I'll tell him. Over the next few days, as Beth grew stronger, something interesting began to happen in Cedar Ridge. Word had spread about Jake's journey through the blizzard to save an Apache child, and while some people remained hostile to the idea, others were beginning to see the situation differently. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house, stopped by the doctor's office with a basket of fresh bread and soup. For the little girl, she said simply, all children need good food when they're recovering. Father Miguel visited daily, sometimes bringing small gifts, a carved wooden horse, a picture book with colorful illustrations. Beth was fascinated by the books, having never seen anything like them before. Even more surprising was the visit from Tommy Peterson, the 8-year-old son of the man who owned the hardware store. Tommy's father had been one of the loudest voices in the crowd that first day, but apparently the boy had different ideas. I brought her some marbles, Tommy said shyly, producing a small bag of glass spheres that caught the light beautifully. My ma said she might be bored just lying in bed all the time. Jake watched as Beth and Tommy began a game that needed no common language, just laughter and the universal appeal of colorful toys. It struck him that children seemed to have an easier time seeing past differences than adults did. On the 5th day, Ayanna arrived. Jake was reading to Beth from one of Father Miguel's picture books when he heard horses outside. Through the window, he saw Ayanna dismounting from one of the Apache ponies, with Tom and Lucy right behind her. The reunion was everything Jake had hoped for. Beth launched herself into her mother's arms with tears of joy, babbling in Apache about everything that had happened. Tom and Lucy crowded around, touching their sister as if to make sure she was really there and really well. But Jake noticed that not everyone in town was happy to see more Apache people on Main Street. A small crowd gathered at a safe distance, watching with suspicious eyes as the family embraced. Thank you, Ayanna said to Jake, her own eyes bright with tears. I do not have words for what you have done. You don't need words, Jake replied. Family takes care of family. Doc Patterson came out to examine Beth one final time and pronounced her well enough to travel. Keep her warm and dry for the next few weeks, he instructed Ayanna. And if the cough comes back, bring her right back here. Ayanna nodded seriously, then surprised everyone by addressing the doctor in careful English. You have been kind to my daughter when others would not. This kindness will not be forgotten. As the Apache family prepared to leave town, Jake made a decision that would change his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Ayanna, he said, I'd like to ride partway back with you. Make sure you get home safe. She looked at him with understanding. And then you would like to talk with my husband when he returns from hunting? Jake nodded. If he's willing. The ride back toward Apache territory was peaceful, with Beth chattering happily about her adventures in town and Tom and Lucy full of questions about everything they'd seen. But Jake's mind was working on something bigger than just getting the family home safely. When they reached the canyon where Jake had first found shelter, they discovered that Ayanna's husband had returned with several other Apache men. The hunting had been successful, and there was meat to last through the remaining winter months. Jake's first meeting with Robert Standing Bear was tense. The Apache man was tall and lean, with the weathered face of someone who spent his life outdoors. His English was better than his wife's, but his expression was guarded as he listened to the story of what had happened during the storm. You risked your life for my daughter, he said finally. Any father would have done the same, Jake replied. Standing Bear studied him for a long moment. No, many men would not have done the same. You could have waited for the storm to pass. You could have said it was not your problem. They talked through the evening, these two men from different worlds who had been brought together by circumstance and shared values. Jake learned that Standing Bear worked as a scout and interpreter for the Indian agent, trying to bridge the gap between Apache traditions and the changing world around them. There are problems coming, Standing Bear said as they shared coffee by the fire. White settlers want more land. Some of my people want to fight. The government wants everyone to move to reservations. It is a bad situation for everyone. What if there was another way? Jake asked. What if some of us could find a way to work together instead of fighting each other? That conversation led to another, and then another. Over the following months, Jake and Standing Bear developed an unusual partnership. Jake would provide cattle and supplies during particularly harsh periods, while Standing Bear's people shared their knowledge of water sources, seasonal patterns, and safe passages through difficult terrain. It wasn't always easy. Some of Jake's neighbors questioned his judgment and his loyalty. A few stopped doing business with him entirely, but others, impressed by the success of his cattle operations and the decrease in rustling incidents in his area, began to see the wisdom in cooperation over conflict. The Apache community was equally divided. Some saw any cooperation with white settlers as a betrayal of their traditions. Others, led by practical people like Standing Bear and Ayanna, recognized that the world was changing whether they liked it or not, and that survival might depend on finding ways to live peacefully with their new neighbors. The arrangement worked so well that word began to spread to other parts of the territory. Indian agents and territorial officials took notice of the area where Apache and white settlers were managing to coexist peacefully. Several delegations visited Jake's ranch to learn about his methods. Beth recovered completely from her illness and grew into a bright, curious child who moved easily between the Apache world and the white world. She learned to read from Jake's books and to track animals from her father's teachings. She became a living symbol of the possibility that two cultures could enrich each other instead of destroying each other. Years later, when Beth had grown up and become a teacher herself, she would tell her students the story of the blizzard that changed everything. She would describe the cowboy who risked his life for a child who wasn't his own, and the Apache family who opened their home to a stranger. But most importantly, she would tell them that families aren't just made by blood or tribe or tradition. Sometimes families are made by choice, by kindness, by people who decide that what unites them is stronger than what divides them. Jake never married again, but he was never lonely. He had found his family in the most unlikely place during the worst storm of his life. And that family, Apache and white, traditional and modern, bound together by love rather than law, became the foundation for a community that proved cooperation was not only possible, but profitable. The story of the cowboy and the Apache woman who saved each other's lives became legend in that part of Arizona. But for those who lived it, it was never just a story. It was proof that humanity, kindness, and family can overcome any storm, whether it's made of snow and wind or prejudice and fear. Some storms destroy everything in their path. But sometimes, if you're very lucky, a storm can blow away everything that doesn't matter and leave only what's truly important. And sometimes, what's truly important is the family you choose, not the one you're born into.